Hi, Liz Shanahan here. I'm a professor in the Department of Political Science. 50% of my time and 50% of my time I am uh, new in this position as Associate VP for Research Development in the VPR's office. I'm presenting to you some of results of some COVID research. I'm a social scientist, so this is the social science part of the presentation here. And you can see in the bottom of the slide our funding entities. And this is my amazing team, Seth. I pulled pictures, but we're from all over the country, lots of state universities here too. So this is a pretty great team, and it's been really impressive what states have ponied up for funds. So the CDC, Center for Disease Control and Prevention, is the premier science agency in our country, and they recommend getting a vaccine. So this talk tonight is about what that means in terms of the public, but based on these clinical trials, they say you need to get a vaccine. And so why? And I think Matt got to this. You reduce your chances of getting COVID. If you get COVID, you reduce how sick you will get. That this has resulted in a reduction in hospitalizations. And you also simply reduce the amount of viral shedding. And so you protect people around you by getting a vaccine. So how do we think about vaccines and vaccine adoption? You can think about this in terms of this continuum, where there are some people who just simply refuse to get a vaccine, some people who say yes, they vaccinate if the vaccine is available, and there's a swath of people in the middle who hesitate in some capacity. They might lean refusing, they might lean to accept, but they're somehow unsure. And this is the population the CDC focuses on, or the county agencies here, I assume too, and MSU perhaps. This is the population to focus on for risk messaging to nudge people to get the vaccine. So a bulk of my work is trying to understand what kind of risk messaging is effective to move people to get COVID-19 vaccine. So with my team, we have two survey efforts largely funded by the National Science Foundation. What's important in these efforts is that I want you to get from this slide is that these are panel surveys. And what that means is that it is the same respondents asked the same questions over time. So we get some longitudinal data. The first survey effort, we surveyed 6 states and we were trying to get representation regionally. The second funded effort, we launched a national survey, and the results here will just be of wave 1 out of that survey effort. All right, so what do you see here? We want to know intent to vaccinate, just sort of broad brush here. Interestingly, in the 6-state survey from May to October, we saw a decrease in people who said, yes, I want to get the vaccine. But then some news started coming out about the Pfizer and Moderna vaccine, and we saw a slight increase of a willingness to get the vaccine. And from the 6-state survey to the national survey, you can't really totally compare one survey to the other, but our results are holding steady. So about 41% saying yes, they're getting the vaccine, 23% saying no, and that important in terms of messaging, middle unsure population at 36%. So we also want to understand variation within why people, say yes and no and not sure. So what are some of the indicators of variation here? And so the first thing we took a look at was ethnicity, and what you hear about a lot in the news and is borne out in our data certainly is that of the people who are saying, yes, I'm going to get a vaccine, very few are Black and multiracial. And the majority of those who say, yes, I'm getting the vaccine are white and Asian. We also looked at partisanship. Again, our data bears what you, I think, have heard probably more colloquially in the media, where those people who say, yes, I'm getting the vaccine tend to be liberal. Those who say, no, I'm not, higher proportion are conservative. And then those who are unsure, it's sort of spread across the continuum of political ideology, but the greatest of that population being the moderates. Now, is there a difference regionally? And again, this is hard to compare because we have a state and versus a region analysis right here. But I just want to focus on one region in particular, and that is the South. In the South, you can see that of those who are willing to get say, yes, I'm getting the COVID-19 vaccine, very few out of the South, in contrast to of those who say no. The South has a strong representation there. And we see in our state data, Michigan and Louisiana are also sort of on that low end of willingness to get vaccinated. In the middle here, this unsure population, we don't have a geographic locale for that. So what that means is that risk messaging really should have a national scope. So additionally, why, gosh, there we go. Why would this, what would actually increase the confidence in COVID-19? So what would make people feel more confident about getting the COVID-19 vaccine? Well, we have some good news here for some of our scientists and in the crowd and those who are training to be scientists, in that even though we have a lot of uncertainty or a lot of talk about how there's a distrust of science, the highest responses really are about FDA approval. Experts I trust say it works and is safe, and healthcare providers recommend the vaccine. So when science comes through, people do listen. The other area that increases confidence is what is really the human-to-human effects here. So waiting for others to see if it's safe, and then when people I know will get the vaccine. Okay, let's talk about risk messaging. Very briefly, scientists and the public speak different languages. Science talks in the language of probability, frequency, magnitude. And humans, the public, regular people, your mom, your dad, your neighbor, you talk in stories. And so we lean in my work in the narrative policy framework, we lean into our literary scholars and use the word homo narrans. Homo sapien is that we are very analytical and we're knowing beings, but we're also homo narrans in that we are communicate who we are, and we're also shaped by stories. And how the power of story is in what's called narrative transportation. And what that means, and you all have had this experience of going to a movie or reading a good book where you are totally immersed in the story, and you have this affective experience that rises and falls with various characters of that story. So the greater the transportation, the greater the power of that story. So what does this have to do with risk messaging? Well, let's take a quick peek at risk messages that we've seen about COVID-19. This is from the CDC. Act now. Maybe this looks familiar from the MSU webpage. I typed those. These risk messages are what I call non-narrative. They are not narrative. These are imperatives of what to do. They are science-based, right? We know that there's science behind masking up that prevents viral transmission. That's all really good. I'm going to make the claim that these are non-narrative and that we can do better. So let's take a look at our experiment. So what we did in our national experiment is that we have these different conditions. So the control condition or the sort of treatment as usual is that imperative, get the vaccine. Well, we kept that call to action. We held that constant across our 3 narrative conditions that you see on the left-hand side of the screen. So what's narrative in this? Well, protect. Part of what makes a narrative is our characters. And the word protect evokes this idea of hero. And so what we do in these messages is situate the target audience as the hero who protects. What we manipulate across these different conditions is the victim. So who is that hero protecting? Yourself, which is the individual, your circle, so people you know, your community, sort of the broader community. And survey recipients received one of these 4 conditions. So we the analysis I did was a moderated mediation model. So on the left, you'll see the independent variables of treatment conditions, those four treatment conditions. The affective response is the narrative transportation. So we want to know what kind of response affectively people have to these different conditions, and if that mediates the motivation to vaccinate. But we also have this belief system. So those three narrative conditions, individuals, yourself, circle, and community, are reflective of this American political ideology that we have in this country, that we have individual rights, and think about this on a continuum, to a community interest. But we, as adults, have already these very deeply embedded beliefs about individual liberty and collective community interests. So we want to see if those beliefs moderate any of these relationships. So what you have on the x-axis is that individualism to collectivism worldview. So the standard deviation below the mean is individualism, the zeros are the mean, and the standard deviation above the mean is collectivism. And what you see here, this is valence. So this is looking at that pathway from the conditions to the narrative transportation. And indeed, the control condition tanks, right? So there's very little variation in that affective response. And what does really well is the protect your circle and protect your community. And so that relationship is indeed moderated by this belief system. And we have a significant pathway from affective response to motivation to vaccinate. So we do, in fact, have a mediating relationship here. So looking at the direct relationship, really interesting results also. We have a moderating response whereby the collectivism worldview does correspond with a stronger motivation to vaccinate. And again, we see with these conditions, the protect your community, protect your circle being the top two, protect yourself being a little bit below that in terms of motivation to get yourself vaccinated. So what do we have here? What's the point? On the top, we have our Bobcat risk messages, and my point is we can do better, and we should do better at nudging, at motivating, and can do better through narrative. And so many thanks. And this is the website for my team. And we have all kinds of technical reports on there, et cetera, if you are interested.